For years now, there has been a loud and confident narrative in gaming communities that goes something like this. Linux is not ready for gaming. Linux is complicated. Linux has no games. Linux is only for programmers. Linux breaks everything. And if you're a serious gamer, you need Windows. That narrative is repeated in comment sections, in Discord servers, in YouTube chats, and even by some tech influencers who haven't seriously tried Linux in years. The problem is not that these claims came from nowhere. The problem is that they are outdated, oversimplified, and often based on assumptions rather than experience. Gamers are wrong about Linux, not because Linux is perfect, but because the picture many gamers have in their heads no longer matches reality. Let's start with the biggest claim. Linux has no games. That might have been partially true 15 years ago. It is not true today. The majority of PC gamers use Steam, and Steam has fundamentally changed what gaming on Linux looks like. Proton, Valve's compatibility layer built on Wine translates Windows game calls into something Linux can understand. For the user, that translation is often invisible. You click install, you click play, and the game runs. Thousands of Windows-only titles are now playable on Linux through Proton. Many of them run at performance levels comparable to Windows, and in some cases even better. When gamers say Linux has no games, what they often mean is that their specific favorite multiplayer title with kernel-level anti-cheat doesn't work. That's a more nuanced issue. Some anti-cheat systems were designed with deep integration into Windows, and developers have been slow to enable Linux compatibility, but that's not a technical impossibility. In fact, major anti-cheat providers like Easy Anti-Cheat and Batala have added Linux support. Whether a specific game enables it is up to the developers. The limitation is often a business decision, not a technical barrier inherent to Linux. Another common belief is that Linux is too complicated for gamers. People imagine endless terminal commands, driver compilation, and arcane troubleshooting rituals. That image comes from a time when Linux distributions required more manual configuration and when hardware support was inconsistent. Modern distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, Pop, _OS, Mint, and others provide graphical installers, driver managers, app stores, and automatic updates. You can install Linux today with a USB stick and a few clicks. You can install Steam with one click. You can enable Proton with a toggle. For the average gamer, the day-to-day experience can be no more complicated than Windows. Yes, Linux still allows deep customization. Yes, the terminal exists. But using the terminal is not mandatory for basic gaming. The idea that every Linux user must live in a command line window is outdated. In many cases, the reason someone ends up in the terminal is because they want to tweak, optimize, or experiment, not because the system forces them to. Then there is performance. Many gamers assume Linux performs worse than Windows. That assumption is not universally true. In CPU-bound tasks, Linux often performs extremely well due to its efficient scheduling and lightweight overhead. In gaming specifically, results vary by title, driver, and hardware. Some games run slightly worse through Proton. Others run almost identically. A few run better. The key point is that the performance gap is not the massive deal-breaking difference many assume it is. Graphics drivers used to be a serious pain point, especially for NVIDIA users. That reputation stuck. Today, NVIDIA provides proprietary drivers for Linux that can be installed easily through most distributions. AMD's open source drivers are integrated directly into Linux kernel and Mesa stack, offering excellent performance and rapid updates. Intel's integrated graphics drivers are also well supported. Is it always perfect? No. But the same can be said for Windows driver updates that break features or introduce instability. Linux is no longer the Wild West of unsupported GPUs that it once was. Another misconception is that Linux gaming requires constant troubleshooting. The reality is that stability on Linux can be extremely solid once set up, because Linux distributions typically do not force major feature updates in the same way Windows does. You're less likely to boot up your PC and find that a massive update has changed system behavior overnight. Many gamers have experienced Windows updates that reset audio settings, break drivers, or cause performance issues. Linux users, especially those on stable distributions, often enjoy a more predictable environment. Compatibility is the most complex issue, and it's where nuance matters. Not every game works on Linux. Not every launcher behaves perfectly. Some third-party tools assume Windows, file paths, or registry access, but compatibility has improved at an astonishing pace. ProtonDB, a community-driven database, documents thousands of titles and how well they run. Many popular single-player and indie games run flawlessly. Emulators thrive on Linux. Native Linux titles exist for many engines, especially those built with cross-platform tools. What gamers often overlook is how much of modern gaming infrastructure is already Linux. Game servers frequently run on Linux. Cloud infrastructure runs on Linux. Many development pipelines use Linux tools. The irony is that Linux is deeply embedded in gaming, just not always on the desktop. There is also the argument that Linux is not worth the effort because Windows just works. But does it really? Windows is familiar? Yes. It has broad support? Yes. But it also includes telemetry, forced updates, background services, bundled software, and design decisions that many users tolerate rather than love. Linux offers an alternative philosophy, user control, modularity, transparency. For some gamers, that matters. For others, it doesn't. But dismissing Linux as inferior without acknowledging trade-offs on both sides is intellectually lazy. Another thing gamers get wrong is assuming that Linux gaming is driven by hobbyists alone. Valve's investment in Linux is not a small hobby project. The Steam Deck runs on a Linux-based operating system. That device has sold millions of units and has brought Linux gaming into the mainstream in a way no desktop distribution ever could. When developers optimize for the Steam Deck, they are indirectly optimizing for Linux. Proton improvements benefit desktop Linux users as well. The ecosystem is interconnected. The Steam Deck also proves something important. Most gamers don't care what kernel their system uses as long as the games run. The narrative that Linux is unusable collapses when millions of players use a Linux-based handheld without even thinking about it. The difference is presentation. On the desktop, Linux feels like a choice. On the Steam Deck, it feels like a product. There is also a cultural aspect to why gamers are wrong about Linux. The PC gaming community often prides itself on technical knowledge, but it can also be resistant to change. Windows dominance created a kind of inertia. When something works well enough, people stick with it. Linux, for many, represents uncertainty. It represents learning something new. Even if the learning curve is smaller than imagined, the perception of difficulty is powerful. Community narratives reinforce themselves. If a few prominent voices say Linux is bad for gaming, others repeat it without testing it. Confirmation bias kicks in. Someone tries one unsupported multiplayer game. It doesn't work, and they conclude that Linux gaming as a whole is broken. Meanwhile, they ignore the dozens of titles that would have worked perfectly. Another misunderstanding involves fragmentation. Gamers hear that there are many Linux distributions and assume chaos. They imagine incompatibilities everywhere. In practice, the core components are shared. The Linux kernel, Mesa, glibk system libraries, Proton works across distributions. Steam installs the same way. Yes, there are differences in release models and package managers, but for a gamer who installs a mainstream distribution and sticks to it, fragmentation is rarely a practical obstacle. Modding is another area where people assume Linux fails. Windows has deep integration with mod managers, file explorers, and legacy tools. On Linux, modding sometimes requires extra steps, especially if tools are Windows. But Wine can run many mod managers. Community guides exist, and for games with Steam Workshop support, modding works the same regardless of operating system. The experience can be slightly different, but different does not mean impossible. Let's talk about hardware compatibility beyond GPU. Controllers work well on Linux, often thanks to the same Steam input layer that Windows uses. Xbox controllers, PlayStation controllers, generic gamepads, many are plug-in. BLUETOOTH. Support is mature. Audio systems like Pipewire have improved latency and compatibility. For VR, the situation is more limited, but even there, progress is happening. One of the strongest arguments against Linux gaming used to be the lack of big studio support. That argument weakens every year as engines like Unity and Unreal provide Linux export options and as Proton makes native ports less critical. Developers no longer need to build separate Linux versions if Proton compatibility is sufficient. From a gamer's perspective, the result is the same. The gamey jooms. Some gamers claim that if Linux were truly viable, everyone would already be using it. That's not how technology adoption works. Network effects are powerful. Pre-installation matters. OEM deals matter. Windows ships on most PCs by default. Linux usually requires intentional installation. Market share is not a perfect measure of capability. It's a measure of distribution, partnerships, and historical momentum. There is also a psychological factor tied to risk. Gamers invest hundreds or thousands of dollars into their libraries. They don't want to risk losing access. The fear is understandable, but dual booting exists. External drives exist. Testing Linux does not require burning bridges. Yet many critics speak as if trying Linux means permanently abandoning Windows. Another thing gamers overlook is system longevity. Linux can run efficiently on older hardware, extending the life of gaming PCs. Windows tends to increase system requirements over time. For gamers on tight budgets, Linux can offer a leaner environment that keeps older rigs playable longer. That matters in a world where GPU prices can be extreme. Security and privacy are rarely discussed in gaming debates, but they are relevant. Linux's permission model, open source nature, and lack of built-in advertising infrastructure appeal to users who value control. Windows integrates more deeply with online services and telemetry. Some gamers don't care, others do. The point is that Linux offers a different trade-off, not a universally worse one. It's also worth acknowledging that Linux gaming is not perfect. Some games won't run. Some updates break compatibility temporarily. Troubleshooting may be required, but perfection is not the standard Windows meets either. Blue screens, driver conflicts, registry corruption, forced restarts, these are not myths. Every platform has flaws. When gamers say Linux is bad, they often mean Linux is inconvenient relative to what they're used to. That's a fair emotional reaction, but it's not an objective evaluation. Familiarity reduces friction. If you grew up using Windows, Windows feels intuitive. If you spend time on Linux, Linux starts to feel intuitive. Human brains adapt. The conversation also suffers from outdated benchmarks. Someone tested Linux gaming in 2016 and never revisited the topic. In technology, 10 years is a lifetime. Proton launched in 2018. The Steam Deck launched in 2022. Mesa drivers improve constantly. Kernel updates enhance performance and hardware support. Judging modern Linux gaming based on pre-Proton experiences is like judging modern smartphones based on early 2000s devices. Another misconception is that Linux gaming is only for tinkerers. While tinkerers certainly enjoy Linux, many users simply want a stable, clean system that runs games. For them, Linux can be set up once and then largely left alone. Automatic updates handle security patches. Steam handles game updates. The experience can be boring in the best way. There's also the argument that developers don't test on Linux, so bugs are inevitable. But Proton compatibility layers are tested extensively by Valve and the community. Bugs get reported quickly. Fixes are often rolled into Proton versions without the game developer changing anything. In so many cases, Linux users receive fixes faster through Proton than Windows users do through official patches. Cloud gaming adds another dimension. As more gaming shifts to streaming services, the local operating system matters less. If your browser supports the service, you can play. Linux browsers are fully capable. In that context, the operating system debate becomes even less critical. The idea that Linux is hostile to gamers often comes from cultural stereotypes. The image of the elitist Linux user who mocks others for using Windows is persistent. But communities are diverse. There are welcoming forums, beginner guides, curated distributions aimed at gamers. The ecosystem has matured. When evaluating Linux for gaming, the correct question is not, is Linux perfect? It's, is Linux good enough for my needs? For many gamers, especially those focused on single-player, indie, retro, or emulation, the answer is yes. For competitive players tied to specific anti-cheat systems, the answer might currently be no. Both answers can coexist without turning into absolutes. Gamers are wrong about Linux when they treat it as a monolith frozen in time. Linux evolves rapidly. The gap between perception and reality grows each year. The narrative that Linux gaming is a joke lingers long after the facts change. Ultimately, the choice of operating system is personal. Convenience, compatibility, philosophy, habit, and risk tolerance all play roles. But dismissing Linux outright, without testing it, without acknowledging the progress made, and without understanding the nuances of compatibility is not a strong position. It's a reflex. If you haven't tried Linux gaming in the last few years, your opinion is probably outdated. If your entire judgment is based on one multiplayer title not working, it's incomplete. If you assume complexity without experiencing modern distributions, you're relying on a ghost of the past. Gamers pride themselves on optimizing performance, tweaking settings, building custom PCs, and challenging assumptions. Applying that same curiosity to operating systems reveals a more balanced picture. Linux is not a magical utopia. It is not a broken mess. It is a viable platform with strengths and weaknesses, just like Windows. The real mistake is not preferring Windows. The real mistake is believing that Linux gaming is inherently inferior in all cases. The ecosystem the tools have improved, the support has grown, and the gap between myth and reality has never been wider. Gamers are wrong about Linux because many are arguing against a version of Linux that no longer exists. They are fighting yesterday's battles in a landscape that has changed. And until more people test it for themselves rather than repeating inherited narratives, that misconception will continue to echo long after it has stopped being true.